Today we will be reading chapter 14, World War I. In April of 1917, the United States joined a war that many countries in Europe had been fighting since 1914. Minnesotans participated in a variety of ways. Hear about a state agency established in response to fears about people's safety. One country's contribution to the war effort, and finally a celebration held in Minneapolis the night of the war ended. So some of the things you are going to be looking for are: how did World War I get started? What are some things everyday Minnesotans did to support the war? What were some tensions surrounding patriotism in Minnesota communities during the war? Describe some new methods of warfare that were developed during this war, and which side won the war. Those are some of the things that you will be looking for. So, in the early 1900s, countries such as France, England, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary all wanted to be the most powerful nation in Europe. They competed to gather the most resources and build the largest empire by controlling other countries around the world. They also competed to build alliances or friendly associations with some of their neighbors. The main idea of the elite alliance system was simple. If one nation was attacked by another nation, its allies would come to its defense. It was a form of self-protection. The system helped keep Europe at peace for many years. Unfortunately, the alliance system could also make conflicts bigger. A small fight between two countries could quickly grow into a large war involving many countries once all the allies became involved. In 1914, this complicated web of alliances helped bring about the Great War, or World War I. So as you can see, here is a map of all the allies and central powers in World War I. You can see Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire all had an alliance with one another. They were called the Central Powers. Also, what you can see is the allies: Portugal, Switzerland. Switzerland was neutral. Portugal, Italy, France, Belgium, Great Britain, Ireland, Russia, Romania, Serbia, and Greece were all the allies. So here we go. The war begins in Europe. Okay, so war begins in Europe. In 1914, an assassin killed a member of Austria's royal family, Austria-Hungary, responded by declaring war against Serbia, the country it held responsible for the killing. The conflict, however, did not stop there. Austria-Hungary and Serbia both had alliances with other countries. One by one, the nations of Europe joined the fight. Before long, the entire continent was at war. On one side were the Allies. On the other side were the Central Powers. Beginning in 1914, the Allies and the Central Powers fought dozens of battles against each other. Many of the brutal battles took place in France and Germany. Millions of soldiers and civilians were killed. America's response to war. When the war began, most Americans and most Minnesotans wanted the United States to stay out of it. They felt there was no need for the United States to get involved in the issues of European powers. There were some Americans, however, who believed the United States should join the war on the Allies' side. They worked hard to change other people's minds. Americans, they argued, could no longer afford to ignore what was happening in Europe. These people claimed that the powerful weapons of modern warfare, especially airplanes and submarines, threatened America's security and economy. Through 1915 and 1916, the war raged. Concern among Americans increased as rumors spread that German soldiers were torturing and killing Belgian women and children. Finally, when German submarines started attacking American ships, the U.S. government decided it could no longer stay neutral. In April of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson called for action. The U.S. Congress agreed and declared war on Germany and other members of the Central Powers. Most Minnesotans, even those who wanted the United States to stay out of the war, were eager to support their country once war was declared. Harold Knudsen of St. Cloud was one of 4 Minnesota congressmen who voted against the United States entering the war. However, when the voting was done and the country was officially at war, Knudsen urged all Minnesotans to put aside their objections and concerns. He believed everyone should join the war effort. "This is your fight and mine," he said. "Many of us were opposed to war at this time, but we bow to the wishes of the majority." So, allies during World War I, the nations that allied or united against the Central Powers of Europe, they included Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and the United States. The Central Powers during World War I, the nations that fought against the Allies, they included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So the war effort was the combined efforts of those at home as well as those in the military to win the war. Proving loyalty. Before 1917, many people in Minnesota believed that the war in Europe was a foreign conflict that the United States should avoid at all costs. Although most of them changed their minds once the United States joined the war, some remained against it. Those who raised questions about the war were often accused of being unpatriotic and disloyal to their country. Throughout the nation, the U.S. government launched a communication program called using propaganda, posters, parades, songs, and other methods to persuade Americans to support the war effort. The government encouraged people to show their patriotism by buying war bonds, which were sometimes called Liberty bonds or Uncle Sam's bonds. The government sold war bonds to Americans in order to raise money to pay for the war. Shortly after war was declared, the Minnesota legislature created the Commission of Public Safety to oversee the state's war effort. The legislature gave the CPS the power to make and enforce laws in Minnesota. It was best known for cracking down on Minnesotans suspected of disloyalty. Its definition of loyalty was simple. The test of loyalty in war times is whether a man is wholeheartedly for the war and subordinates everything else to its successful prosecution. That meant people were expected to make winning the war their main concern about everything else in their lives. Germany was one of the countries that the United States was fighting against. So German Americans and German immigrants were among the CPS's targets. The CPS pressured schools to stop teaching German. It censored or limited what German language newspapers could write. It discouraged German music because so many people in Minnesota were of German descent. The actions of the CPS affected many. Some Minnesotans responded to the anti-German mood by changing their German names. Families with names like Schmidt tried to prove their loyalty by adopting the name Smith. People no longer refer to sauerkraut by its German name. Instead, they called it Liberty Cabbage. Tension in Minnesota communities. In the summer of 1917, anti-German feelings reached a new level. German Americans in New Ulm held a peaceful meeting to discuss the war. The speakers talked of loyalty to the United States and the importance of obeying laws. Yet they felt unable to fight against their own relatives. In Germany, they agreed to ask the government not to send their young men overseas. This did not sit well with many Minnesotans. Newspapers around the state called the people of New Ulm traitors. Governor Joseph Bernquist even removed the German-American mayor of New Ulm from office because he feared the mayor was disloyal. Soon, immigrants from many different countries, not just those from Germany, discovered that their loyalty was being questioned. The CPS ordered all Minnesotans who were not American citizens to register with the state. They had to fill out forms disclosing where they lived and worked, how much property they owned, and why they had not become citizens. The CPS also cracked down on other people and organizations that it suspected of being disloyal. It launched investigations, banned political rallies, and publicly accused some groups of being traitors. Patriotism questioned. One group targeted was the industrial workers of the world. IWW, a labor union whose members included iron miners and lumberjacks. Another was the Nonpartisan Legion, a political organization of mainly Minnesota and North Dakota farmers. Nearly all the members of these groups considered themselves patriotic Americans, but they did not question some of the government's actions during the war. In the atmosphere of fear and distrust, some Minnesotans participated in bullying and mob violence against members of the IWW and the Nonpartisan League. Nels Hochstad, a farmer who lived near Hinckley, found out the hard way that it could be dangerous to support a group labeled as disloyal. When he tried to give a speech in support of the Nonpartisan League in the spring of 1918, a gang of masked men grabbed him and hauled him away from the event. Hochstad refused to be silenced. 2 days later, he returned to give another speech before the crowd of 750 cheering farmers. Clearly, some Minnesotans believed it was possible to support the Nonpartisan League and still be a patriotic American. As time went on, some Minnesotans concluded that the CPS had too much power. Ambrose Ty, a lawyer on the commission, was among those who felt the CPS had gone too far. He came to believe that even though he was one of the people who had originally started the CPS, he spoke out, saying, "Give even good men too much power," saying that the CPS's actions during the war showed how dangerous it is to give even good men too much power. By February of 1919, the Minnesota legislature had shut down the agency. So here's a picture of Minnesotans from Hutchinson. They showed their support for the war effort. In a parade in November of 1917, they carried signs with anti-German slogans. Hun was an insult that compared Germans to a barbarian people called the Huns. One country's contribution. Norman County in northwest Minnesota was about as far removed from the fighting in Europe as anyone could imagine. Nonetheless, when the United States went to war in the spring of 1917, the people of Norman County sprang into action. Hundreds of young men from towns such as Ada, Halstead, Twin Valley, and Baruch volunteered to join the fight. Most everyone else stayed at home and contributed to the war effort. In other ways, they raised money for the Red Cross. They purchased war bonds to help the government pay for the war. They knit socks and sweaters for the troops. During the fall, many people left their jobs in towns to help harvest crops, taking the place of the young men who were off fighting the war. 27-year-old William Tompkins was one of the first Norman County men to volunteer for military duty after the United States declared war. He had spent nearly all his life in the farmlands of Iowa and Minnesota, but now he was eager to serve his country and to see the world. In the fall of 1918, he boarded a ship to Europe as a private in the U.S. Marines. The realities of war. Like many Americans who fought in World War I, Tompkins was sure the United States and the Allies would eventually defeat the Germans and the Central Powers. "We are going to win this war, no question in my mind," he wrote. "I know in our outfit we will fight as long as we have got life." At first, Tompkins was excited to be a part of what President Wilson called the war to end all wars. Soon, however, the excitement wore off. In a letter to his friends in Norman County, Tompkins described the war as a dreary struggle full of suffering and danger. "We have just gone through 15 days of hell. We went 48 hours on a quarter of water and practically nothing to eat, and there was something doing all the time. The Germans put a barrage over us from 12 to 1 at night, and then repeated the next morning with another one from 4 to 5. I never will forget that night, for life was not worth much. Lying in a hole about 3 feet deep, but I came out okay. The next night they shot gas shells in on us for 4 hours, and that stuff is hell. I tell you, no one can tell me what war is like now, for I know all about it." Tompkins remained confident that he would survive the fighting and return home to Minnesota when the war was over. I expect to come back, he wrote, after living through this barrage. The other night, I believe God is with me. On October 9th, 1918, Tompkins was killed in action during a major attack that the Allies mounted on German forces in the northeast France. He was 28 years old. 1 month later, on November 11th, 1918, the war ended. The Allies had defeated the Central Powers, just as Tompkins had predicted. Another Norman County Marine named Richard Storberg was among the American fighters who survived to see the war come to an end. One by one, the guns fired their last shell, and the sounds of war began to cease. He wrote, "At 11 o'clock, everything was quiet. It was such a change that we couldn't hardly believe it. More than 800 men and women from Norman County had served as soldiers, Marines, aviators, sailors, and military nurses during the war. 63 of them, including William Tompkins, died in combat or from illness." The war ends. News of the war's end reached Minnesotans just before 2 o'clock in the morning on November 11th, 1918. The towns and cities across the state, bells rang and whistles blew, waking groggy Minnesotans from their sleep. People threw on their clothes and gathered in the streets celebrating the end of what was then America's longest and bloodiest foreign war. The state's biggest celebration took place in downtown Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Tribune described the scenes as a carnival. Lights flashed, windows and doors opened. People began pouring into the streets, and in less than half an hour, a multitude of men and women were downtown renewing their celebration of world peace, singing, shouting, laughing, weeping, ringing bells, blowing horns, pounding cymbals, and bestowing affection of greetings upon those who were strangers the day before, but were all brothers and sisters of freedom in the bright hour that had come at last. America does not go in very much for carnivals, just as she does not go in very much for war, but when she celebrates, she does it as hard and as tirelessly as she fights. And yesterday was her high tide of celebration, not only in Minneapolis, but in every community of every state in the Union. In all, more than 126,000 Minnesotans, including about 700 women, served in the military during World War I. Nearly 3,500 of them died while serving their country. Some Minnesotans wondered whether the United States should have sent so many young men to their deaths. Others, including Private Joel Prigg of Norman County, thought the war was worth the sacrifice if it meant the nation was done fighting wars. "One thing is sure," he wrote in a letter to his family and friends, "we want to know when we come home that the war is a thing of the past." A popular belief during and after the war was that if the Central Powers were defeated, then future wars could be avoided. Many believed that the democratic governments, like those of the Allies, would spread to the communities and that these new democracies would not be interested in building empires and taking over the countries. It was a hopeful ideal, but in the end, it did not hold true. For many years, November 11th was celebrated as the day World War I ended. Today, it is known as Veterans Day. The national holiday was established to honor the men and women who fought in all of America's wars, including those who came after World War I. So this is what downtown Minneapolis looks like just after World War I. They hosted a parade. Okay, so I'm going to stop there if you want. Thank you for reading along with me. If you want, you can pause at this portion of the video and just read these things to yourselves and look at them. Are you a patriot? This is talking about propaganda and how they would target people and get them to believe that going off to World War I was a good idea. Okay. The end. Good job, guys. Have a wonderful day.